Alright, so this is something new for me as I'm going through and doing a screencast for all of you since I'll be out this week. You just read one of my absolute favorite documents that you could be studying in AP European history or AP World History or really just any history at all. The document that is the Schism of 1054, the breakup of the Western Roman Catholic and the Eastern Greek Orthodox Church, the official time where Cardinal Humbert walks not so humbly into the Church of Constantinople, into the Hagia Sophia, drops off this letter, walks out, and feels free of the burden of those pesky Greek Orthodox that refuse to submit to papal authority. It is a beautifully written document, very succinct, a perfect Dear John letter for all you ladies who are thinking about dumping that schlub that you keep carrying around with you, or gentlemen for that matter. A document that you get to see every little thing that patriarch Michael gets wrong in his theology and his practice. And so today's little mini lecture that you're going to be listening to here goes through why. What is exactly happening there? Now, I'm sure that you have already gone through this document, had a discussion about both the political and cultural causes for the Schism of 1054. And what I wanted to do is just provide you with a little bit of context in order to understand the document a little bit better. So we're going to go through the division of Christianity, this East-West schism. Really, we're just going to look at the separation of Eastern and Western Europe as a whole. And we're going to begin with the East. Now, of course, in the fall of the Roman Empire in 476, as we've already discussed both in AP World History and in AP European History, the fall of the Western Roman Empire is really only the fall of one half of what was the Roman Empire at the time, long before 470, well, long before, I guess that's about 100 years before the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. Constantine, the emperor of the Roman Empire, moves the capital of the Roman Empire away from Rome and then into the city of what is then known as Byzantium, that gets affectionately called Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And while many of the Roman institutions remain in Rome, the Senate actually stays in Rome as kind of a tie back to those glory days of the Roman Senate and the Roman Republic. But effectively, all administration moves over to Constantinople. And this is the first time we see a real division between the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire. And so in 476, when Rome gets sacked by the Goths, really the eastern part of the empire carries on as if nothing had really happened. The Roman Empire continues both in name, both in practice, and is largely seen, the Byzantine Empire is seen as largely a continuity of what the Roman Empire was. And so that's where we see again this idea that Constantinople remains the capital of the Roman Empire. The emperors are going to consider themselves Roman empires. They will call themselves Roman. They will practice Christianity as it's even understood, even in that time period, as Roman Catholicism. But we will see that it will have some slight differences as it develops. One of the biggest things for for the Byzantine Empire is its continuation along these Silk Road trade routes, especially being even closer to the east and to those trade routes. Constantinople is going to be a city of vast riches because of that connection to trade, and we even know that the Byzantine coin, the byzant, is going to be used all along that trade route throughout Central Asia, and even have some evidence of it being in places like China. And so the Byzantine Empire again is going to maintain that prosperity because of its control of trade. Again, it's going to maintain not just economic prosperity, but also for a time political centralization, especially with only half of the empire in order to maintain. The most famous of the emperors are going to be Justinian. You see a wonderful picture of him there on the screen. Of course, Justinian is the more masculine looking of the two, despite the fact that some people think he continues to look like a lady. I'm sure many of you have already watched the John Green videos on the fall of the Roman Empire, and he jokes about how Byzantine and really, well, Roman, but Byzantine mosaics aren't very good at distinguishing gender. However, you can kind of see a little bit of a beard or a mustache. Doesn't look like Justinian was very well endowed with the beard gene. But anyway, Justinian is going to maintain the centralized power of the Roman Empire in general, and on more than one occasion, he is going to attempt to reconquer Italy, reconquer places in northern Africa, try to make the Mediterranean the Roman lake once again. But eventually, while he has some short successes, eventually it's just impossible to maintain the power over such a large empire with a bunch of other things going on, which we'll talk about in just a second. Something that Justinian is given credit for is codifying Roman law and organizing it all into what is known as the Code Justinian, or Justinian's Code. It's going to take local cases and essentially apply a centralized Roman interpretation of that law. There will be a law book, there will be law interpretations. This is going to kind of be the basis for a law code for not just the eastern part of Europe, but also even in the West, as Charlemagne is also going to ask for a copy of the Code Justinian in order to implement into his own Frankish kingdom, which will then make its way into the Holy Roman Empire and to other subsequent kingdoms within Western Europe. Of course, not only are they going to have the continuation of Roman trade, the continuation of Roman politics, but also the continuation of Roman religion, which at that point had been Christianity. And the Byzantines are going to be developing and continuing with the practice of Caesaropapism started by Constantine. Caesaropapism being the control of Caesar over Pope, essentially making the Roman emperor the head of both the state and the church. And probably one of the most famous things that you see in the Byzantine Empire, and especially in Constantinople, is the building of the Hagia Sophia, a gorgeous cathedral that is erected and is supposed to make you feel like you are in heaven. You are in heaven as you enter. It's hard to see in this image, and especially hard because this has been converted into a mosque. But since then. But if you can see those hanging chandeliers at the bottom of that picture, it's supposed to literally make it feel like the heavens are inside. And remembering, of course, there's light that comes in, but there's a limited amount of light, and therefore it is going to make it seem like you're in this night sky with these candles lighting everything. But that just shows, again, the continuation of Christianity. Of course, as you've already probably discussed a little bit, as the Byzantine Empire continues to develop and continues to develop without the West, you're going to see some cultural differences that are going to occur. Particularly, the church in the East is going to continue to use Greek is going to start using Greek over Latin within their formal circles. Greek is going to be the main sort of language of the Eastern Church. You're going to see churches continuing in that Greco-Roman tradition. They're going to look very different than those Gothic cathedrals that will eventually be developing, that you're going to be researching today and watching a documentary on tomorrow. After your exam. So not tomorrow, Thursday. There you go. It's going to be very different from those Greek churches that are there. Now, I'm not going to show the video here, but if one wanted to, one could go to, of course, as Gabe can point out to you, you can go to resources, you can go to Western Foundations, you can then go to my foundation slides, and I would encourage you to watch this video. It's just a visual images and some video of 5 Byzantine churches, as the title kind of shows you, and it goes through some of the mosaics, some of these icons that are famous throughout the Byzantine tradition. Side note here on the use of icons being just religious symbols, as the picture that you can see there. The Byzantine Church as part of its kind of breakaway, and you see the development of varying traditions between the West, is going to go through what's known as the iconoclasm, the iconoclast debate, whether or not it is in keeping with the Ten Commandments in order to have these images of both God, of Jesus, of the prophets, of the story. Again, the reason for these was, of course, to try and show beauty and grandeur and the glory of God and all that, but also, more importantly, to be able to teach an illiterate population the ins and outs of the Christian tradition. But there was a huge debate among Byzantine scholars within the church saying, is it right to have these images? Are we worshiping the image or are we worshiping God? Because if we're worshiping the image, therefore we're then breaking the Ten Commandments, and therefore we're then not worshiping God. So there was this major debate, which actually results in the banning of icons by one of the Byzantine emperors, Leo, I think his name was, but and one of the Byzantine emperors. So actually, there are quite a few icons within churches and monasteries that had been destroyed, and you can see some evidence of that within some of these videos. So I encourage you to watch this video. We don't have time to go through. Well, while the East is continuing in that glory of the Roman Empire, we've already talked about how the West had already begun to disintegrate into those various little Gothic or Germanic kingdoms. Well, as those are getting a little bit settled, as we talk about the Angles and the Saxons in Britain, the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in France, the Ostrogoths are eventually going to be in Italy. The Kievan Rus are going to be up in what is now modern-day Ukraine or Russia. And then, of course, the Holy Roman Empire developing out of the Carolingian Empire as well. Oh, and of course the Danes and the Jutes and all them in Denmark. But we don't like to talk about the Danes very much. It's bad enough that they live in Solvang. So what you start to see happening in the 9th and 10th centuries, probably a little bit in the 8th centuries, is you have another wave of foreign invasions in the West. And what this is going to do is actually dramatically change the context of the West, and especially as it develops into those formalized kingdoms, and as you are reading already this coming weekend, as this kind of forms into what are known as our Renaissance states. So before the Renaissance can happen, you have to have kind of the formalization of political and economic and social customs that will be developed in the West. And of course, I'm not going to go too far into these, but you do, of course, have the Muslim invasions. Now, we've talked about that with the development of Spain. You have the Umayyad dynasty that has rapidly spread across northern Africa and will eventually invade into Spain and will make it all the way into what is now kind of the border of Spain and France, and will be stopped by that Carolingian Charles the Hammer Martel. But you see again a Muslim invasion in southern Europe and Italy, and those are not the only places that Muslims will be invading, or the word that's used in that map, or Saracens or Arab invasions. But you can see it happens in southern Italy as well, not just in Spain. So you have these Muslim invasions. Again, from the east, you're also going to have a group that are known as the Magyars, who are going to be coming from Central Asia or Indo-European group. And they are going to essentially move into, of course, what is now, as you can see, France and Gaul and Italy, and they're really eventually going to retreat back to Eastern Europe. They are going to be what is now kind of the history of modern-day Hungarians. But this is going to be a group of people that is going to wreak havoc as well. Now, the most important and really famous of these invasions, now when I say important, that's just my bias, but one of these important invasions are, of course, the Vikings from Scandinavia. These are Germanic peoples who decided for some reason that it was beneficial for them to live in the frozen lands of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. These Germanic peoples of Scandinavia. Now, these people are farmers. For the most part, they're trying to scant out a meager living in and around fjords, trying to farm on incredibly difficult farmland and incredibly harsh conditions. Now, part of Scandinavia's makeup is not only bitter cold, but also long fjords. Now, fjords are literally inlets from the sea. Norway has one of the longest coastlines in the world, despite not being a very large country in and of itself, because of these inlets called fjords. And because of their connection to fjords, fjords, and because fjords made access to other places easier by boat, the Vikings are also going to be very adept seafarers as well, and are going to develop some seafaring technology that is going to allow for easy travel and fast travel, and travel not just across an ocean, but using that same exact boat to go into a river, which is really going to terrify Europeans in northern England, and of course the French, but when are the French not terrified? And of course, because of living in such a hard surrounding, because farming is something that is difficult in these Scandinavian places, they are also going to develop a warrior culture. It is very much so a culture of the toughest, the strongest, those who are willing to do whatever it takes to survive will survive. And so they have a very warrior culture. This is then, and another thing that's really fascinating about Scandinavians is that they are one of those weird exceptions. Typically, the farther away you get from the equator, the shorter people get. According to the rules of biology, Scandinavians and Vikings should look more like Gimli from Lord of the Rings, should look like dwarves, but they're one of the exceptions in that they are incredibly large. And being absolutely huge, and at that point in time in history, they were much larger than the 5'3", 5'4" average people in mainland Europe. So the Vikings, when they start invading, beginning in England in a place called Lindisfarne, in northern United Kingdom, they are going to look like absolute giants wielding axes, which will terrify the local people for good reason. For those of you that are good enough to remember Jackson Stormo. Jackson Stormo is a great example of what those Vikings would have looked like. You just slap a beard on Jackson Stormo and, well, there you go. So they had a large exception. Typically, a Scandinavian or a Viking season would go, of course, really tough winters, incredibly tough winters, starting to plant in the spring, and then they would go on summer raids. Every single summer, they would then go raid. Typically, those raids took them east towards Russia. In fact, the history of the Kievan Rus is actually a Viking tradition. Vladimir had Viking ancestry, which is another reason why Ukrainians and Russians sometimes have blonde hair and blue eyes. That's neither here nor there. But eventually they are going to be going westwards towards England, and then down into France, and then eventually all the way down into the Mediterranean. But those summer raids would then try to bring back some riches, some food, oftentimes slaves, things that would be able to give each of the villages and communities of Scandinavia some wealth. And then, of course, you'd come back for harvest season, so one can collect all the food and then eventually get into storing up for the incredibly tough winters. Now, I don't mean the 60-degree winters of Santa Barbara. We're talking frigid weathers. Now, those summer raids and those invasions are going to continue till about 1000, and then, of course, the question is, why do these invasions seem to settle down? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, it is that you start to see defenses being built up. These kingdoms are going to organize and formalize and create defenses that will make it more difficult for the Vikings in order to be successful at their raids. Now, another reason and explanation for these invasions stopping is, well, because the Vikings simply just settled down where they wanted to settle. An example of that is the eastern part of the United Kingdom was something called Danelaw, the place where the Danish laws were accepted because Scandinavians simply just settled down there. Another famous example of that is, of course, Normandy, which is northern France. Why is it called Normandy? The place of the Normans or the Norsemen. Oh, it all makes sense now, as that was a territory given to the Viking Rollo in order to stop the invasions of the further Viking invasions. Essentially, we'll allow you to settle here, we'll give you these beautiful lands, we'll give you some titles, we'll do this and that, please stop hacking us to death. And that's where you see, again, a lot of the settlements of the Vikings into those territories. Now, why do we spend so much time talking about these invasions by the Muslims, by Magyars, by Vikings? Well, it's because of these invasions that you see Western Europe taking the form and the structure that we most know as the Middle Ages, and of course the name that all of you walked through as you did your La Collina projects in 8th grade or 7th grade or whenever you did it, and that is feudalism. The social slash political slash economic system of the Middle Ages is a direct effect of these invasions. There was an incredible need to protect the people, the land, everything from these invaders. And so what this then becomes is a set of relationships designed in order to create a line of defense to stop these invasions from reaching, well, the king, of course, but also the royal lands. And so what you see developing is this relationship between a lord and a vassal. Now, anybody who owned or held land could be a quote-unquote lord and or a vassal. Now, typically, a king is going to be given charge of a large amount of territory. That king is then going to give a portion of that land to a nobleman, part of the family, or an extended family, or some sort of alliance there, and that noble will then become a vassal of the king. Well, in return for that land, the king is expecting that noble to set up fortifications and defenses from the Vikings in order to stop sort of invasions. And that's where you see the development of castles all along rivers and all along places where the Vikings and others could have invaded. And so in return for the land, or the land grant, which is otherwise known as a fief, there was some sort of service that had to be rendered. A noble or a count would have to provide military service and taxes back to the king in exchange for that. Now, of course, the nobility isn't going to just want to fight on their own. They want to be able to have a group around them as well. And so each nobleman, and each king for that matter, is going to have a group of knights. Now, those knights are going to be those professional soldiers that are going to be given land by their lord, by their noble, and in exchange they will provide military service. They will provide protection against the Vikings, but they will also provide military service and kind of police service for the general area around. Of course, then you see peasants who are also going to be granted land, or at least be charged with working the land that the noble would have. And again, their job is to provide the labor, or the labor, and provide the food stuff and taxes back to the lord, and then in some cases all the way back up to the king. Because of the precarious nature that the Vikings and other invaders gave, you see serfs largely becoming the property of these nobles. They were called serfs, and serfs were essentially slaves. They were peasants who weren't necessarily officially the property of their noblemen, but for all intents and purposes, they absolutely were, because the lord not only did not allow them to leave the land, they were forced to stay there. They weren't allowed to marry without the permission. They had their own systems of justice. The noble could do whatever he wanted to do to these serfs based off of whatever he felt was appropriate. So again, because of the need for protection, because of the need for a military structure, and because of the need for food, you see the development of feudalism as a social system. Now, it very much so was a relationship, and it wasn't as easy as I'm making it out to be. Oftentimes, there were knights who were vassals to multiple lords. You would be a vassal to one lord, and then maybe a vassal to the king directly. And then if the noble just decides to rebel against the king, who are you loyal to? And it was quite a complicated situation oftentimes. But in general, that is how the social system was. It was very stratified. It is not possible for a peasant or a serf to just move up because, boy, they're good at farming. Oftentimes, there's those wonderful stories of chivalry and knights, and there's Heath Ledger and A Knight's Tale going from a ward or a peasant all the way up to a knight that marries a princess, and that did not really ever happen. except in fairy tales. And so this is really the foundation for each of the different kingdoms that you were researching last week and that you're going to be possibly writing an essay on tomorrow. Now, the one crazy exception that develops during the Middle Ages are townspeople, people who are going to live in kind of what we see as is carryovers from the Middle Ages, those cities, those towns that were left over from the Roman Empire. This is going to be hubs of trade, of course. The prime examples of that are going to be places like Paris, are going to be places like London. There are going to be places in northern Europe that are going to be right along the Rhine River, right along the Baltic Sea up there, that are going to be those Hansas, which are going to be kind of trade unions. Those are going to be these places that are going to have a little bit of a different relationship. They are going to be outliers, and the people that live in there are in French known as the bourgeoisie. That's going to be a very important word for you to know during AP European history. But in German, they're also known as the delicious burghers. Now, these towns are going to have a special relationship to the king because of the wealth that they are generating. Not only are they craftspeople, but they're also merchants that are bringing things from all over, not just Western Europe, but eventually, when Western Europe actually gets its act together, eventually places like the Byzantine and possibly even places all the way from the Middle East and Northern Africa. And so kings are going to grant special privileges, special tax exemptions to these people. They are, even though you might be a poor craftsperson within a city, you are not going to be a serf. So there's going to be sort of special privileges for those people who live in towns and who are craftsmen or merchants and things of the like. So they're going to be outside of that social system. Of course, a majority of people are going to be peasant serfs during this time. A small minority are going to be the nobility and knights, and of course a very small minority are going to be kings. And that's essentially the foundations of feudalism and really the context and the foundations of the division between East and West. While the East continues along Roman lines with the insertion of Greek traditions, the West is going to be a mixture of Roman, of Gothic, of Viking, of Magyar, of Arab. You're going to see this very fragmented system of feudalism replacing Roman traditions, or mixing and fusing with Roman traditions, which is going to be the large division between East and West. And so in 1054, when you look at why there is this division in the once unified Christian church, it's largely because of what was happening during this time. The East was very much so continuing on, while the West was changing and morphing and developing its own unique traditions that are going to be a blend of all those other groups that I already said. And this is going to cause a rift between the East and the West, which is why it's going to be a popular fashion to not have beards in the West, but to have beards in the East, to use flat and fluffy bread, all those very important spiritual questions that God is going to hinge upon. If you get it wrong, and if you take the wrong type of bread at communion, you can find yourself on the wrong side of those pearly gates going into heaven. So what you're going to be looking at right now is as we look at these dark ages, and again, we're doing a flyover unit here. We are not doing as good of a job as they did in La Collina. We're just getting kind of the basic foundations here. But a true question that I want to ask is, during these dark ages, how dark exactly was it? Is this truly is my claim that Western Europe just becomes bumble scum, can't take two hands and slap its own bum? I mean, is that really an accurate depiction of what was happening? So you're going to be researching different pages. The sub will go through the instructions with you. The instructions are also on Neo, but I encourage you to have fun with this because this is a really interesting question. And when we look at some of those developments that happened during the Middle Ages, we're very lucky for some really bored and quiet monks sitting by candlelight and just copying things down. It's going to be absolutely fascinating to see some of the developments that happen in the Dark Ages. So I hope you enjoy. I hope you enjoyed this little presentation, and I hope that you have a wonderful week.